Welcome to the second week of our study on the book of Ruth. We did have an online class at 9:15 on Sunday, but somehow I didn't manage to get that recorded on Zoom. So I'm recording this later so you can listen to it at your leisure. I'll cover the same material. Unfortunately, we won't have some of the participation of the other folks who showed up for the class because I didn't record that bit. Now you're just dealing with me. So here we go. We began with an opening prayer we actually used as our prayer, Psalm 62, verses 6 through 9. For God alone my soul in silence waits. Truly my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold, so that I shall not be shaken. And God is my safety and my honor. God is my strong rock and my refuge. Put your trust in him always, O people. Pour out your hearts before him, for God is our refuge. I picked this psalm as a starting point for us because Naomi, and to some extent Ruth, of course, are having to wait for God. They're having to find that they do indeed have hope in God. Because their situation, at least as we find them at the end of the first chapter, is relatively hopeless. Naomi has lost her husband and her two sons. Ruth, of course, has lost her her husband. Both women have lost their obvious means of support and care. So that's where we pick up as we begin this second week on the book of Ruth. And the opening question really I wanted to pose to people is God always fair? Is God always fair with you? Is God always fair with others? And the short answer is no. God does not always seem to be fair. Even if we think that God is fair with us, we can look at others and say, wow, how is it fair that that person lost her husband? How is it fair that that person lost their job? How is it fair that that person is homeless? We look and we wonder, is God really indeed fair? And part of it is a question of perception. It was raised in our class discussion, the idea that what may not seem to be fair to us, what may not seem just to us, well, God may see that in a very different way. God may have a different understanding that clearly we may not always have. We had not finished up chapter 1 in our first session, so we continued there. Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 to 22. And we begin with, of course, Ruth and Naomi are headed to Bethlehem. Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, has heeded Naomi's admonition to go back, and so she is. But Naomi is still with, so Ruth is still with Naomi. Ruth is still hanging on. Ruth is going to be Naomi's companion no matter what. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. I have a question of what does it mean that the whole town was stirred because of Naomi and Ruth? Stirred is one way to translate that verb. Another way is simply to say they were excited. They were stirred up, in other words. They're thrilled. Look who's back in town. I think maybe that's part of the excitement. Remember, Naomi has been gone well over a decade at this point. And she's gone back and she is remembered. She is remembered. I'm reminded of, from time to time, I go back to St. John's Cathedral in Albuquerque. And even though I've been here in Dyersburg well over a decade, there are times when I go back to the cathedral for various things, like 3 years ago or so, I was back for my dad's funeral. And every time I go back, there's somebody there who's always just so glad to see me. And I don't know if they're really glad, but they certainly act like they're pleased. And I will tell you, it does my soul good. That even though I'm gone, I'm not entirely forgotten. And that's got to be a good feeling. So Naomi, despite her loss and the challenges, you know what? There's something good here. Now, she doesn't seem to be able to see it as yet. Don't call me Naomi, which of course means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. And that's how she sees her life. It's a life of bitterness. God has dealt bitterly with her. She had plenty. God has left her with nothing. God has dealt harshly with her. God has brought calamity upon her. Just call me bitter. That's where Naomi finds herself. And it raises the question, frankly, have you ever felt bitter towards God? Has God ever treated you bitterly? And that's a rhetorical question. I didn't expect the class participants to actually answer that. But it raises the question, can we move from bitterness and to what? Should we? Is it even possible? Is it even wise for us to express such anger, such bitterness towards God? We might think that's unbecoming. We might think that's not something that people of faith should ever do. But we've got plenty of examples in the Bible where people do exactly that. Reminded of what happens in Psalm 137. Boy, I tell you what. I mean, this is written during and about the Babylonian exile, right? Verse 137 reads, "By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept." Right? So these are people who are in exile, and they're thinking about their oppressors, right? And what do they say about their oppressors? Their prayer is this in verse 9. "Happy shall he be who takes your little ones, you Babylonians, who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock." Well, that's a horrible thing to say. It's a horrible thing to say, and yet we find it in our Psalms. We find it in our Bible. Why? Well, the answer is simple. We should not shy away from genuine expressions of anything before God. However strongly, however negatively we may feel, bring it to God. God can take it. If we're angry, if we're hurt, if we simply seek vengeance, share it with God. We're not going to knock God off God's throne. We're not going to stop God from loving us and caring for us. God wants us to be honest. As our parents used to say to us, or at least mine used to say, just tell me the truth. We should, because God can take it. So Naomi here is offering some truth to God. It's hard truth. And yet in the midst of this, there is opportunity for hope. I mean, we look in verse 22, Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite. Right? So she's with Ruth. She's back in her homeland. And by the way, they were there at the beginning of the barley harvest. This is good timing, because one of the immediate needs they're going to have is, how are they going to feed themselves? They don't have husbands or fathers or brothers or any men to help provide for them. And this is a very patriarchal society. So at least there is the barley harvest. And we'll see a bit later what they can do in the context of the harvest by means of gleaning. The other thing to note here is that Ruth is referred to as Ruth the Moabite, the one who came from the country of Moab. It is no mistake that Moab shows up twice in the same sentence about Ruth. This is never an accident, particularly in Jewish literature. When you see the same name or the same word repeated, or at least some variation of it repeated, that is the Bible's way of saying, pay attention to this part. Moses stood at the burning bush and God calls out, Moses, Moses. That repetition is a pay attention, pay attention. And here we're called to pay attention to the fact that Ruth is from Moab. She is a Moabite. She's not from around here. She's from somewhere else. She's an alien. And we're not to forget that. And we're going to be reminded of that time and again in the verses that follow until we get to the end. When Ruth completes her journey from Moab to Judah, from being a Moabite woman to being a woman of Judah, a person whose faith is connected with Moab to somebody whose faith is now in the Lord God, the Lord of Israel. So we'll see that movement in how she's identified as a Moabite here, and later on that will cease. Now we opened our session with this bit of Psalm 62 where we have to wait. Naomi is having to wait, right? She's going to have to wait on God, and that's tough. It's tough to wait on God. And we're not always good at it. I'm reminded of the old prayer, "Oh God, give me patience and give it to me now." Well, that's not always how God works. But the great thing about waiting is we do not need to wait alone. Certainly Naomi does not wait alone, because of course Ruth waits with her. And there's great power in that. There's great power in that. I think back to my time when I was a hospital chaplain, when I was doing my clinical pastoral education as part of my seminary preparation for ministry. And one of the things that I learned, and it's one of the reasons why they do hospital chaplaincy, is that hospital chaplains are called into hospital rooms and waiting rooms and situations where people are in great distress in moments of crisis or grief, and you realize you don't have the words. There are no words to say that can fix what's going on. All you can offer is yourself. All you can offer is to be present with those who are suffering. But you also learn that presence, that holy presence, that godly presence. It's not going to fix everything, but it sure makes things easier to deal with. That godly presence, that ministry of presence, is powerful and important. And that's what Ruth is exercising here, her own ministry of presence with Naomi. We think about loss and the loss experienced, of course, not just by Naomi, but also by Ruth, of course, is the loss of their husbands. And one of the materials I'm using for preparing this class includes this quote from a woman named Renita Weems, who writes, "Ask any woman who has lost her husband, and she will tell you that a widow's mourning is eventually interrupted by reality. Soon she is forced to suspend the grieving process long enough to focus her attention on the matter of how she will survive when mourning has passed. It is the persistent love of Ruth's friendship which helped bring about Naomi's healing." And I've been witness to this, not just widows, but I've come alongside a number of families who are planning funerals. I mean, here they are at their moment of greatest grief and pain and loss. But you got to deal with the reality of, you got to plan the service. Are you having a visitation? Are you going to do a reception? Who's going to do the readings? And what readings do you wish to have? And all those choices must be made. You've got to step out of your grief, at least fully enough and long enough to deal with those realities. Likewise, Naomi and, of course, Ruth as well, they have to step outside of their own grief to deal with the realities of how they're going to survive. And so they've got both short-term and long-term needs. But as Renita Weems points out, it is the persistent love of Ruth's friendship that is so integral to the healing. We're reminded here again that what really matters here is so incredibly is relationship. Now, Ruth is not a book about Ruth's relationship with God, at least insofar as God is there in some sort of active conversation or dialogue. They are not. God is certainly active in this story, no doubt. But the real relationship we see, at least at this point, is the one between Ruth and Naomi. And in that relationship, we can see a mirror of the relationship we have with God. The kind of care that God has for us is not unlike the kind of care that Naomi, and as we'll see in a few minutes, Boaz, have for Ruth, and that Ruth has for Naomi. I think of weddings. We celebrate weddings and the love of a couple getting married. We see that as being a mirror of, an example of, a reminiscent of the kind of love, the very love that Christ has for Christ's church, a love of giving and sacrifice and utter devotion and commitment. So relationship, it matters. It is important, not just because it's important to Naomi and to Ruth, but in their relationship, we see a reflection of our relationship with God. I next asked the group if there was ever an unexpected act of kindness that impacted them in some way. For my own part, I think of when I moved to Dyersburg, nearly 13 years ago now, and I come into my new house. It was that was still the rectory owned by the church, and the pantry was full of food. The fridge was full of food, and the freezer was full of food. I mean, these were people who did not even know who I was, and yet they had packed the fridge and they had packed the pantry with stuff, both stuff quite useful and welcome, and stuff a little more puzzling. I'll be honest, I was a bit of a loss what to do with the pickled beets. Not usually on my menu, but the kindness of that gesture was unmistakable and deeply touching and profoundly welcoming to somebody who was new to the area. So kindness, it's a theme we're going to pick up on here as we begin our walk through the second chapter of Ruth. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. Now, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Before we get further, let me note here, we hear about a prominent rich man. Now, when we encounter prominent rich men in the Bible, in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, we come to look on those with a measure of suspicion. because prominent rich men don't always come across too well in the Gospels. There are exceptions, but for the most part, not so much. But here, a prominent rich man, this is a very good thing. It's a very good thing that Boaz is a prominent rich man. And we're told right up front he's kin to Elimelech. This will matter immensely, especially in later chapters. But to continue. And Ruth the Moabite, oh yeah, we're still calling her a Moabite, aren't we? Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. Now, as it happened, and I have to stop here because it almost is as if to say, oh, and by coincidence. There is no coincidence. This is a Bible story. As it happened, really. No, it happened by design, I'm sure. And this is God at work. And we're not going to say that. We're going to claim that out loud, but surely that's what's happening here. And I think that's what people would have understood. Anyway, as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Okay, twice in 3 verses we're told that Boaz is kin to Elimelech. Again, that repetition tells us, aha, this is important. Pay attention to this. Now just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Oh, to whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "Well, she is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Now let's talk for a moment about gleaning. This idea that when the reapers go through and the harvest is ready, they're going to gather as much as they can, as quickly as they can, which means there's going to be a few scraps and bits and leavings behind. Because for them to gather up everything would slow them down, I'm sure, just too much. The Bible understands this, and Mosaic law understands there's going to be leavings, and in fact, there should be some stuff left behind. Leviticus chapter 19 reads, or includes the following: "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien." So the poor are among those who, under Jewish law, are allowed to glean. But it's not just the poor. 4 chapters later in Leviticus, there's a repetition of this theme about who can reap. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges. You shall not gather the gleanings. You shall leave them for the poor and for the alien, right? The foreigner, the immigrant. You can see where this has led to interesting conversations in modern contemporary American political conversation about how it is we treat immigrants to our nation and those who find themselves in our land. Regardless of what you think about whether they came in legally or illegal or any of those questions, if somebody's a foreigner and they're on our land, not that we have to follow Mosaic law in every aspect, I suppose, but it certainly raises the question of, as Christians, how should we respond to them? I digress. So we know that gleaning is meant to be available to the poor and to the alien and to another group as well, from Deuteronomy. The gleaning shall be left for the widow. All right? Leave something for the widow. So think about Ruth, who's going to glean in the field. Well, she's hit the trifecta, the hat trick. She is all 3. She is a poor alien widow. So she's got 3 times the normal reasons to be able to glean in the fields. And so that's exactly what she's going to do. And it addresses the short-term need of how are she and Ruth going to, or how is she and Naomi going to survive? They've got to eat something. Well, it's the harvest, and gleaning is permitted. And so we ask this question, what practical matters do they need to address at this point? Well, as I said, they've got the short-term need of how to survive for this week, this day, but they have the long-term consideration as well. Harvest will not last forever. They need something else on which they can rely. They need someone else on whom they can rely. That needs to be part of their long-term answer. And perhaps that's why Ruth says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." So Ruth is already thinking long-term here. Right? Does Ruth experience God's goodness in any way here? Well, of course. Of course, she finds a field where she is permitted to glean. That was the law, but we don't know how well everybody observed that law. We don't know how generous people were in permitting the poor and the alien and the widow to glean in their fields. But she did find a place where she was permitted to do so. And in fact, Boaz, what does Boaz do? He ensures that she is allowed to do that. So what do you think of Boaz so far? His name means strength, but what do we think about him? Well, we know some important things. We know that he is kin to Elimelech, which holds out the promise that maybe he can be what we will come to find as a redeemer, somebody who will then become somebody to protect and provide for Naomi and for Ruth. He's prominent, he's rich. Oh, that's all very good. Also, look at how he treats the hired hands. He gets to the reapers, and the reapers are there to do one thing. They are there to gather the harvest as quickly, as efficiently as possible. But he doesn't come in and say, all right, how many bushels have you gathered? Right? How many hours have you worked? He instead says, the Lord be with you. And they respond in kind, the Lord bless you. What a way to begin a conversation. He wants to talk about God, not what they've gathered. And that's a great place to start. And I think that reveals something about Boaz's character. The other thing we know about him, of course, is that Ruth has caught his eye. I don't think in any kind of bad way or anything like that. I mean, it's just that, hello, who is this young woman? And he's already showing an interest in her. Well, continuing on, verses 8 through 13. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Now that's interesting. Listen, my daughter. If you go back a few verses, Naomi said the same thing to Ruth, called her my daughter. Now Boaz is doing the same. He doesn't even know her yet, but he's addressing her with care already. Interesting. Anyway, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Well, then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground, and she said to him, why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, may I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants. So we see a developing, again, I'm going to use the R word, relationship. We see a growing relationship between Ruth and Boaz. We go from this first conversation, we'll see where it builds from here. But the first thing we notice is, again, that kindness. Boaz is so kind to Ruth. He's going above and beyond what the law requires him to permit a poor person or an alien or a widow to do. He's calling her my daughter. He's saying, don't go over there, stay here. Stay in my field. Stay with my people. They've been told not to bother you. And in fact, when you get thirsty, because she will, it's hot work, hard work out there all day long. Go in and drink out of the refreshments, the vessels of whatever is to drink that has been set out for the young men doing the work. In other words, Ruth is already being taken from being the outsider, Ruth the Moabite, right? It doesn't say Boaz said to Ruth the Moabite, just as Boaz said to Ruth. So she's already moving from that outside position of being the foreigner to the inside position. She's already not just a gleaner who follows behind, she's invited to come alongside the reapers and share in their refreshment. So Boaz is being kind. That much is clear. We might ask why. And part of that is he understands her story. He understands Ruth is a good person. Ruth has done so much for her mother-in-law, right, since his kinsman Elimelech died. Ruth is amazing because she has left her family and her support network, her support system. She's left the country that she's known and the customs that she's known and even the faith that she has known. She's left that all behind to be with Naomi, to come to a people, to a place, to a faith that she did not know before. That's pretty exceptional of Ruth. And Boaz recognizes that and is happy to reward that. One of the materials I'm relying on in preparing for these classes is a study Bible, a Jewish study Bible, that notes the 12th verse really is the center of this book. May the Lord reward you, Boaz says, for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. What's happening here is that Ruth, as she's undertaking this journey from Moab to Judah, is taking a journey from her faith, her Moabite faith, to a Jewish faith. From whatever god or gods she had been worshiping to worshiping the one Lord, the God of Israel. And so this is being seen as, or has been seen in Jewish scholarship in particular, as talking about Ruth's conversion to the Jewish faith. And that's a big part of this as well. For a book, again, that doesn't speak a lot explicitly about God, this is very much a God moment. And Boaz is recognizing that and praising that and really preparing Ruth for her ongoing conversion. And Ruth, who starts off as a Moabite and therefore unimportant, uninteresting to matters of Jewish history, faith, or tradition, becomes more and more important. By the end, we'll see her place in the genealogy, her place as King David's great-grandmother, and in Matthew's gospel, her place in the genealogy of Christ himself. So, but that's the starting point of an outsider. That's the amazing thing of someone who starts off as an outsider, who then becomes, as you might say, the ultimate insider in a way. Verses 14 to 16. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, mealtime not necessarily at the end of the day, this is midway through the day or partway through the day. Boaz says, come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in this sour wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. There's a lot happening here, right? I mean, more and more Ruth is being taken out of the place of the outsider and being brought inside. She's invited in to eat bread that she did not, baked with bread that she did not glean, that she did not harvest. I mean, she's invited to share in wine that she did not purchase. And it says sour wine, but it would have been seen as quite refreshing in those days. She sat beside the reapers. Again, she's not following behind. She's brought alongside them, almost as an equal. And she's given parched grain, meaning grain that is good to eat. So after all of this, you got to ask, how does Ruth feel about her new community, right? Well, hopefully she's feeling pretty good because she's treating so very well. And part of what's happening here is when you look at somebody and how they treat others, they reveal something of their faith, whether they mean to or not. St. Francis once supposedly said, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. What we say and how we treat people reveals our love for God and our love for each other. Ruth is saying these are people who are good and kind, and therefore their God is likely good and kind as well. So Ruth may feel that way about these people and how she's treated by these people, but it is Boaz in particular who's being so kind, inviting her in, and then saying twice that the servants are not to reproach or rebuke her. Twice saying, affirming to his young men, to his reapers, that she is permitted to glean, and even that they should take an active role and pull out handfuls of grain from the bundles to make it even easier for her. So Boaz is becoming pretty important, I would think, in Ruth's view, certainly in terms of his generosity. And we think about her desire not just to find a field in which to glean, but maybe somebody she could maybe. And Boaz seems to be filling that role pretty well She's looking for somebody who can provide for the more long-term needs that she and Naomi have. Ooh, Boaz certainly seems like a good candidate. We get to the closing verses of chapter 2. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Oh, blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite, I guess her journey from Moab to Judah isn't quite complete yet. Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, not Ruth the Moabite, but Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise, you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Well, thinking about the gleaning again, she gleaned about an ephah of barley. Again, this would have been hard work. Granted, she was given some assistance, but an ephah would have been about 2/3 of a bushel. That was a lot of grain to glean when you're picking up the scraps. That was a lot of grain to end up with at the end of a day. So this is a woman who clearly, she is both working hard, but she's also been blessed by Boaz and his care. So we got to ask, Naomi, who described herself as being so bitter at the end of the first chapter, here we find her at the end of the second chapter. Is she perhaps feeling a little less bitter? Come on. She's recognizing that sorry, I lost my place for a moment. Is she feeling less bitter? One would hope so, because she understands that she is now, she is seeing blessing. At least she's calling forth for blessing. Speaking of Boaz, she says, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living." Right? She's got to be feeling a little less bitter, because it's not just anybody who's shown some kindness and interest. It's somebody who's a relative. Wow, that's pretty good stuff. It's pretty powerful stuff. So hopefully life is becoming a little less bitter, maybe a little more pleasant. The chapter ends, "So Ruth stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law." It would be easy to imagine adding a simple verse that said, "And they lived happily ever after." In other words, it'd be easy to see this being the end of the story. It's not, of course. Ruth and Naomi have sorted out their short-term needs, their need for food for the day. But the harvest is ending. What's going to happen next? How are they going to meet their long-term needs of an opportunity or somebody to care for them and provide for them in not just in the weeks to come, but in the months and the years to come? Well, that's a good question. And it's a good thing we have 2 more chapters of Ruth before we finish our journey. As I said at the beginning, this is simply a rough recreation of what I offered earlier this morning, when I actually had people online but somehow failed to record the presentation. So this is shorter than we would have expected, but we're lacking some of the interesting conversations and observations that were shared by the participants. So if you're listening to this online, and clearly you are, hope you'll come back and join us live on Sundays at 9:15. Or again, if you can't be here at 9:15, we'll continue to post recordings of these presentations. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today, or joining me today, and God bless you.